And the diencephalon is the smaller component of the prosencephalon, formed of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So in our coronal section here, we are, as we're in the very front, we're not even going to pick up the third ventricle. So starting, it have to be tomorrow, looking at these coronal sections, back to this again, when we first cut into the brain, we don't see any of the lateral ventricle. And then as we move back, we'll get a little bit of grazing section of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. And then as we move further back, we're going to get into the third ventricle. Usually when we cut the third ventricle, we're also seeing the inferior horn. Okay? So now when we're in the third ventricle, we're going to see the temporal lobe. We're going to be able to see the third ventricle, the globus pallidus, lentiform, the putamen part of the lentiform nucleus, and the inferior horn and hippocampus. So that's probably the more common of all the different coronal sections that are shown, and that's what I have on view here. All right? So the thalamus is a large oval structure that forms the wall, the lateral wall of the third ventricle. And when you look at it in the brain model, most of the way we're used to seeing it is in a sagittal view as this structure right here. Okay, here's the corpus callosum. And down here would be the third ventricle forming this kind of circular structure as a lateral wall of the third ventricle. All right? However, it also goes posterior. So in lab, right there, when you look at the brainstem model that you put away, you'll see that posterior view of the thalamus. So you can open this out. What's this area right here called? Insula. Okay. Jacob, do you mind just holding that green door stop? Letting the door close. So that would be the insula. This structure that you see right here is the head of the caudate nucleus, bulging into the lateral ventricle. All right? And then coming around, and the rest of it's going to be down below. So when I open up, here's the corpus callosum. When I open up the lateral ventricle, and when you do this on Tuesday with the sheep brain, guess what you're seeing in there? Right there. The head of the caudate nucleus. Remember, it bulges into the lateral ventricle. So when I take this structure off, here's the lateral ventricle. Recognize that shape that's going around. And then here's the head of the caudate nucleus, bulging into the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. And on this model, you can follow it down into the inferior horn and see the tail of the caudate nucleus. Okay? Netter, if you have a Netter's atlas or access to the images, he has a good drawing of this view, looking down on top. Okay? So head of the caudate, and then curving around body and tail of the caudate with its relationship to the lateral ventricle. Notice this structure that's medial, that's the thalamus. So the medial surface of the thalamus is forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle. My finger is in the third ventricle. But that's not just the thalamus, it continues posteriorly. And so you can see that here, if you look in the back, this is also thalamus. All right? So it has this big bulging portion in the back. It's known as the pulvinar region of the thalamus. Now the thalamus functions primarily as a sensory relay. So if I kind of change this out a little bit, we have the pulvinar. And that doesn't contribute to the third ventricle. It's kind of more medial than that. So on page 80 of your lecture notes, 78 of your lecture notes, I've listed some regions of the thalami, each identified as a nucleus. There are really only two of those nuclei that I want you to be able to identify. I'm kind of just sharing the other functions. So, page 78, I misspoke the first time. And this is as a sensory relay system. And I've already showed that to you when I was talking about these pathways before. So I'm going to diagram it. Can I erase this from earlier? So next Friday, we're going to look at sensory pathways, and we'll do this in a little bit more detail. But let's say that this region right here is spinal cord. Okay? And this will be a section through the brainstem. And then we're going to take the next section and bring it up and make a smaller view of that. And this will be the section through the parietal lobe. So we have our lateral and third ventricles, gray matter of the parietal lobe, and our lateral sulcus here, and the thalamus. All right? So here's what happens. I touch a surface with my left hand, and I get a splinter, and it hurts. All right? So my sensory neuron is going to come here and form, I find the cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. Remember, that's what the dorsal root ganglion is these pseudounipolar neurons. It comes into the spinal cord and stops in the posterior gray horn. And then another neuron forming the gray matter of the posterior gray horn will cross to the opposite side and form part of the lateral white column. It will go through the brainstem and it'll go into the thalamus. Okay? There it will synapse with cell bodies of the thalamus. And it was my hand that I hurt, so somewhere out here, this is a small brain. And it'll synapse with the neurons that are processing that pain. Now let's say that I went to lift my hand, so I bent my finger to look at it, and I know that I bent my finger, so that's proprioception, instead of just pain. But that neuron also has its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion. But instead of synapsing, it's going to go up the spinal cord in the dorsal white column. And in the brainstem, it will stop. And that second neuron will cross over. And it will send its sensory fiber to the postcentral gyrus. So that's what the thalamus is, especially the ventral medial nuclei. It's a collection of cell bodies. It's gray matter, the nucleus. And most of it are the cell bodies of these neurons that are carrying the sensation to the parietal lobe. If you're hearing, it's carrying sound sensation to the temporal lobe. That's what the medial geniculate nucleus is. It's a collection of the cell bodies that are the third neuron in the pathway of carrying sound to the central lobe, to the temporal lobe for processing. All right? The lateral geniculate nucleus is for vision. So in lab tomorrow, I'll show you the lateral, well, I can do it today if you want to, but the lateral geniculate nucleus. So let me just draw that pathway. We'll do it again when we get to vision in our next unit. All right, so now I'm going to draw a transverse section through the brain. So occipital lobe is back here. Here is parietal and frontal lobe. And my eyeball here. Lateral ventricle. And third ventricle. We're looking, taking the top of the head off. All right. So thalamus. Now let's draw those neurons in. So from my eye, through the optic nerve, remember we had bipolar neurons? So there's a bipolar neuron. And it was activated by the rods or the cones when I saw some photon hit my eye. That second neuron will come into the thalamus at the lateral geniculate nucleus. If I see something over on this side of my retina, that neuron will cross over and go to this nucleus. Okay? Again, we're going to go over this in more detail or more slowly. The bipolar neurons are found in the retina, and this will cross over and go to that side there. So to relate it to structures that you know, okay, this area would be the retina. Optic nerve coming out of the eyeball. Optic chiasma. Optic tract. Lateral. Geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, made up of the neurons that are now going to carry this information to the primary visual cortex. So the neurons that are going out to the primary visual cortex to help you decide what you're looking at have their cell bodies in the thalamus. That's what the lateral geniculate nucleus is. It's the cell bodies of the 1, 2, 3rd set of neurons carrying the information from your eye back to the occipital lobe for processing. Okay? That's what we mean by a relay center. So the thalamus is the relay center for all of our sensory input except for smell. Taste and hearing, pain, touch, temperature, all of that is going to go to the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, neurons will carry that information to the appropriate primary cortex of the appropriate lobe. The thalamus can actually even process pain. So if you're unconscious and somebody pokes you with a pen to see if you're really unconscious, the thalamus can process that as pain. But if you're unconscious, your cortex isn't functioning. And so when that information goes to the cortex, it's not being processed there and projected to the appropriate location. So if they jab your hand with a pen, you'll move your whole body rather than just your hand. All right, because you're not able, without the cortical function of the parietal lobe, you're not able to localize it as your hand. You'll feel the pain, but it won't be acknowledged. You won't know where in your body that pain is coming from. So the entire body will try to get away from the pain. Yes?
You said that you only wanted us to
So you don't need to identify, I'm not going to say which of the following nuclei of the thalamus is involved in emotions or is involved in pain, touch, and temperature, except for lateral geniculate and medial geniculate know our vision and hearing, because we're going to find those on the models. The others we're not going to worry about finding, so you don't have to know about specific functions between the nuclei. Okay? All right, so let's stop there.